Hi, I'm Andrew Bell from the Ray White Bell Group. I've been in the industry some 50 plus years and met some of the most amazing people. And I've always been fascinated by their journeys. People who started with nothing and created something. People who've faced some of the biggest setbacks and taken the biggest risks. And I've always wanted to know more about their defining decisions, what shaped them to be who they are. I created the Andrew Bell Conversation because I've always believed that the most powerful stories are the ones that people rarely tell publicly. Beyond success, titles, headlines are the moments that truly shape a person. The pressure, the setbacks, the risks, and the defining decisions. Hope you enjoy this month's episode, and don't forget to subscribe to future conversations. The purpose of these afternoons was not just to talk about necessarily singly the achievements, but what shaped the man, what formed them to be the great people they have been, because all of our people here, everyone here today, have got family. And it's harder than ever to shape family today with all of the outside influences. So I want to start with your early journey. This for you, I know, is so important, your earliest years. You were born in July?
July 1939. The 26th of July. I share a birthday with Mick Jagger. He's much younger than I am, and he's had a slightly different life, but it's a free country, a free world. It was.
So you're born to Lyle and to Mona, and they were born in 1896 and 1903, respectively.
Yeah, that's true.
And their lives were shaped by World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, and perhaps the formation of that early Australian way.
Oh, well, my dad, incidentally, his mother, I discovered some time ago, had actually been born in Southport.
Yeah.
Now, those Queenslanders knew how to vote when I was Prime Minister. I don't claim it was just her influence, and then as a young girl she wandered over the border and met this marine engineer who'd been born in St Peters in the inner suburbs of Sydney. They married and had 9 children, of which my father was the eldest, and he worked for CSR at the Harwood Mill, Clarence River, and he volunteered and fought on the Western Front in World War I. He was gassed in Belgium, but he survived, and he had 4 sons, of which I was the youngest. And his father put his age back from 44 to 40. I mean, it was in 1917. Those recruitment people weren't looking at birth certificates very closely in those days. They were just desperate to get people who would join up anyway. That was the story of so many families in those years. And Mum and Dad got married in 1925. And Dad started a petrol service station. They're very much in the news. I had my first job serving petrol at Dad's garage, which was in the inner Sydney suburb of Dulwich Hill. I was about 14 or 15. I was paid what I would describe as son's rates. And I learnt that the customer was always right, and that if you made a mess of something, it was your fault, it wasn't the customer's. Good lesson in retailing.
So how much of that upbringing, with through your father being a self-employed man, influenced your journey in life?
I developed a great admiration then for anybody in small business. It wasn't just Dad, but he worked his insides out, poor bloke. And he was a very dedicated parent and a dedicated patriot, and he believed very much in God, King and country as it then was, and it is again. But I learnt sympathy because you had to have licences then for everything. And this was in the days when, before petrol service stations went one brand, where he had a Shell pump, He had a COR, later BP pump. He had an Esso, or Atlantic Oil as it then called. He had a plume pump, which was mobile, and a golden fleece. And you had to have separate tanks underground, separate licences. And nothing has changed, it's got worse. And in the end, of course, the local council, the Marrieville Council, of cursed memory of that particular event, told him that he had to remove his petrol pumps from the curb because it was dangerous and because they were installing traffic lights. And he said, well, I don't object to the traffic lights, but I run a petrol service station. Where do you want me to put my pumps if I can't have them on the curb, where they'd been for 25 years? And I said, oh, that's easy. Put them inside. And he said, oh, yeah, my customers all going to stop and drive inside to get the petrol. He said, I don't think it'll happen for very long. And the attitude of the council, well, that's your problem, mate. I thought that was pretty rough, and I developed, I suppose, a bit of a scorn for the indifference the system displayed towards the small man. And whenever, years later as Prime Minister, we'd be debating something around the cabinet table, and what would be involved was, on occasions, not often, but occasions, was whether it was going to hurt the small bloke. And I always came out in defence of the small bloke. And I just felt I had it to my dad. And it's basic fairness. I mean, people often say to me, you know, what are the Australian ethics and values? And I said, looking after the small man is one of them. Not overdoing it, but if you've got a all things being equal situation, I was always in favour of helping small business people because they did it tough. They didn't have people advocating for them. They didn't have big companies throwing their weight around. And they didn't have big unions muscling them either. So
You wouldn't have that happening here on the coast, would you, Tom? No way. He would support that you could put your fuel bales right on the curb.
Who were you interacting with?
Mayor Tom Tate.
Oh, yes, he's a good man.
Is that good? So this experience with the council, this started to sort of hone the political interest, which you're going, that's just not fair, what's happening. Your father had to try and fight them, and this is when you felt like you got to do something to help the average man.
Oh, look, I was interested in my family. My parents both were what you would call conservative, traditional, patriotic Australians. I don't think they ever voted differently, but it wasn't a case of my mother doing what my father said. She independently formed her views. She was a very strong-willed lady. I do think they voted differently on one occasion. And I remember they had an argument about it. It was, would you believe, a referendum to ban the Communist Party in 1951, a long time ago. I was about 13, or my maths is right, 13. And Dad was keen to vote yes because that's what Bob Menzies was recommending. My mother said, oh, Lyle, I don't know about this. Menzies would be a bit of a dictator. I remember the word she used, if he had his way. And Dad said, oh, no. Anyway, they had a short, sharp exchange. It was very short, but gee, it was sharp. I never heard anything more, but to this day, and my father died when I was 16, so I don't know if I ever talked to him about it, but years later I talked to my mother and she said, oh, look, your father was keener on Menzies than I was. I liked him, but I thought he could, he was a bit full of himself. That was the word she used, expression people of that generation used. And I admired I don't know how I voted. I suppose I thought Bob Menzies was a great bloke. I think it was terrific what he did for this country. And if I'd had a vote then, I'd have voted yes. I don't know, but that's not the point. The point is that the only occasion I remember them, on every other occasion they were as They were two very strong supporters of the Liberal Party, but not uncritical, and that, I guess, is what anybody should be, whether you're Liberal, Labor or whatever. And I've always said that I thought Bob Hawke was the best, and I stress the adjective, the best Labor Prime Minister this country's had. I think he was. And he was a bloke that I could talk to. We agreed on a lot of things. His sporting passions mirrored mine to some point, although he was keener on horse racing than I was. And I once said to him, "Hey, Bob, you're meant to be a Republican. I'm the monarchist." The Queen, who's then arrived, she was pretty keen on horse racing. I said, do you talk about the monarchy when you barrack for the same horse? And he said, no, mate. He said, I wouldn't do that. And but he was a good fellow to deal with, and I respected what he tried to do for Australia. I didn't agree with a lot of it, but that's the nature of public life.
Let me take you back to school years. You went to Canterbury Boys High School, and you developed, obviously you're a good student because you went on to do law, but that's where you started to get involved in debating.
I went to Canterbury Boys High, which then was one of the 8 or 9 selective high schools that were operating in Sydney. And, if I want to locate, I grew up in the suburb of Earlwood, which in the context of rugby league was half Canterbury Bulldogs, half St George, and you can see which team I gravitated
the Maroons he was
towards. And I got the more maroon-coloured red tie. Well, I tell you what, when I was Prime Minister, those Queenslanders knew how to vote. So I did. I developed, and I was at Canterbury between 1952 and 1956. And I remember in the last year I was at school, the English teacher said, "I'm going to get each of you to write down the 3 occupations that you might want to pursue." And I did. I wrote down lawyer. One of my older brothers, who's now deceased, he was an outstanding corporate lawyer in Sydney, and he partly influenced me, not totally. And a journalist. So I always thought writing newspaper articles, because I used to read them and disagreed with a lot of them. And finally, would you believe, a detective? I thought, it was an odd, and I didn't say politician, because in those days, you didn't regard going into politics as being something of a total career. It's something you did after you'd made your mark. And to this day, I get a lot of young men and women coming to talk to me about their future, and they say, "You got any advice? I'd like to go into politics." And I say, "Well, go and do something else for 10 years. Then you'll be a better politician." And I don't think it's a good idea to have too many people in Parliament whose only life experience has been politics. Now, if you're on the Labor... Interesting reaction. No, I think it's right. I mean, if you're Labor, you go to school, you go to university, and then you leave university, you go and work for a union, you then get into a politician's office, and then you get into Parliament. Well, I'm sorry, that doesn't give you and if you're a Liberal, you go to university, you might give the union a miss, well, they might give you a miss, but then you work in the staff, and then, and it's no excuse to say, I work in corporate affairs for such and such a company. That means you're dealing with government every hour of every day of every week now. A certain number of those people are great, and I don't want to denigrate, but I just think we have to have more people in Parliament who've had some of life's experience. I practiced law for 12 years before I went into Parliament. I had an interest, great interest in going to Parliament. And I had to go for a state seat in Sydney, in Des Moines in 1968, and thankfully I lost. And I was meant to win, incidentally. It was a marginal seat. And I'm ever grateful to a fine Irish Labor politician by the name of Reginald Francis Xavier Cody, who helped run the Brewers Union in Sydney, and he beat me. not heavily, because he was not meant to beat me, I was meant to beat him. And I remember on the night of the election, one of his supporters came up to me, because I went down to congratulate him. I thought he'd done well, and he was a decent opponent. And this lady said to me, "I hope you get pre-selection for a safe Liberal seat." And I said, "Well, that's very nice of you." I said, "No, after this, they'll think I'm a bad investment." But anyway, I fortunately did. But I think all of that background, particularly working in the law, not just law, anything. School teacher, I married a school teacher. I have great admiration for them. Public servant. My late father-in-law was a wonderful senior public servant with the New South Wales Railways. So I just think you need in Parliament a group of men and women, both sides, who've had plenty of life's experience before they go into politics. But I've probably jumped over your questions, I'm sorry.
It's not unusual.
Drag on a bit. My wife said to me as I left this morning, "Don't talk too long."
So, schooling got you into debating, and debating became so important for you in being able to put together persuasive arguments through your political career. Never looking at notes, an incredible memory. You've never used a teleprompter. I've seen you stand in function after function, speak for an hour, talking too much, speaking for an hour without blinking and not a reference to notes at all.
Well, I was gifted, fortunately, with a reasonable chronological memory, and I did a lot of debating at school. And one of the advantages of debating is a lot of impromptu debating. It meant that you could get up and talk without much preparation. And I give credit to my late mother for that. She had a very good chronological memory. She used to tell me that her mother-in-law and the lady who had been who'd been born in Southport, that's right, she used to often ring Mum to find out the birthdays of her, 30-odd grandchildren, because Mum had, I don't know whether Mum kept the list, but Mum said to me, "Oh, I know," and just had this, and I must have inherited it, but it helps. And I do think that if you can't win an argument, or you can't hold your own in a debate or an argument, you shouldn't go into politics. Because politics requires skill. It requires you to like people, you like meeting people. I have come across some people in politics, I won't embarrass them by naming them and say, "Oh, I hate meeting people." And I'm thinking to myself, what on earth are you doing in politics? And it's part, and also being able to mount an argument, being able to argue your case, whether you're right or wrong, or you win the argument. I mean, the reality is that I must have won the argument at least 50% of the time for a few years, but then I lost it and the public voted me out.
You went overseas?
Oh, I went, I did the ritual, the Australian rite of passage of going to London, working there for a while and then doing Europe. Although on the way I went to, and this was in 1964, a long time ago, and I went to Singapore, Malaysia, India. Fascinating going to India. I found, I went to a sitting of the Indian Supreme Court in New Delhi. And India, like Australia, is a federation. And of course, it's also it's a federal system, and it's also got, sort of the same inheritance of English law. And just fascinating, the connections, sitting. And I then went to Israel. I've always been interested in Israel, and at that time, it was before the 1967 war, and I'd entered Israel from an Arab country, and I therefore couldn't go to Jerusalem. And so I couldn't at that time see all of the holy shrines, Christian in particular, that I was interested in. And but that was just the nature of things. But I found then a fascinating thing. I stayed at a waterfront hotel in Tel Aviv, and the fellow who ran the hotel, he detected my accent. He said, "You're Australian?" I said, "Yeah." He said, we love Australians. We remember them way back to World War One. And of course, Australian troops have been involved in Palestine, and the famous light horse charge at Beersheba was the last great light horse charge of military combat. And it was just something that occurred to me, not only at the time, but years later. I always further developed an admiration for the Israeli people, for the Jewish people, because of what they'd endured and what they'd achieved. And that country has a lot in common with Australia. It's classless. Every man or woman is equal to somebody else. And that's the Australian way, and it should, I hope, remain the Australian way. I then went to England and worked there for a few years, for a few months, and then did travel around Europe and came back through North America, and I paid a call on an uncle of mine who'd been in the Royal Australian Air Force during World War II, and there was a big training scheme run by the Brits and other British Empire countries in Canada, and he trained as a pilot. He was I think he ended up being in Bomber Command, and he met and fell in love and married a Canadian girl from Calgary, and they came to Australia for a few years, and then he went back and lived in Canada. But the point of all of that is that I was the first close relative he'd seen in 15 years, so we sat up till the early hours of the morning talking about family and experiences, and I think we imbibed too much Scotch whisky, but he enjoyed it, and I helped him. So
you made your way back to Australia after your trip on the 9th of July in 1974. You were elected.
I was elected when Gough Whitlam was Prime Minister, and I was elected in May of 74, and the very first sitting of Parliament I went to was the joint sitting of the Senate and the House of Representatives that passed all of the bills that had formed the basis of the double dissolution. Gough Whitlam I respected very much as a parliamentarian. I didn't agree with his political decisions. I didn't think he understood the importance of having a well-ordered economy, but he had charm and style, and I respected his parliamentary flair. He had plenty of that, but his policy decisions were another matter. But I won't go into that because this is not a political occasion. I haven't come here to denigrate people in the Labor Party. I've tried not to do that because we're all trying to build a better Australia. And, I mean, people despair about our country. I'm an optimist. I don't think there's anything wrong with Australia that can't be fixed with a decent change of government.
So, you had your inaugural speech at Parliament. Did you envisage the journey you were going on? Did you have the ambition at that stage, I'd like to be Prime Minister?
Oh, look, I think if they're honest, everybody who goes into Parliament has a Field Marshal's baton in the knapsack. And I don't think I was any exception, although I never thought that things would work out as they did. And at various stages along that journey, I thought I would have no hope, but I never despaired. I was interested in issues. I was very interested in policy development. I was very strongly interested in workplace relations. And I hope that I demonstrated when I was Prime Minister a willingness to deal with issues as they arose. And I mean, the answer is no, I didn't. And I supported Malcolm Fraser. I was involved as a Member of Parliament in 3 ballots when he was aspiring to be leader, and I voted for him on each of those occasions. He, like all of us, he had his flaws, but he was very good to me and gave me promotion and opportunities, and I'm duly grateful for that.
1977, you were appointed to be assistant to the Prime Minister. You certainly can move up the ranking.
It was, and right at the end of that year, of course, he asked me to be Treasurer. Philip Lynch had been ill, and it was decided that the best thing to do was for Philip to resign, and because Fraser wanted to have an early election, and I understood why. And Philip did, and I was appointed, and then Philip came back after the election, but he didn't want to be Treasurer again. He obviously remained Deputy Leader of the Liberal Party, and he became the Minister for Manufacturing Industry, and I remained as Treasurer. And that was a very interesting 5.5-year experience. We did some good things, and there are a few things I would have wanted to have done. I wanted then to introduce a GST, but I got knocked over in Cabinet. You've got to win more than 50%.
You were 38. That's a young age for a Treasurer.
And then when we lost, some of the things that I championed were then sponsored by Bob Hawke and Paul Keating. They were a good combination. I think Keating was a much better Treasurer than Prime Minister. I thought they were a good combination from the Labor Party's point of view in those relative positions. And then we lost.
There was a recession on at the time, wasn't there?
What?
There was a pretty severe recession on at that time.
Oh, yeah, but you're being kind, but I think we lost. I think we lost because not enough people voted for us. And it's a bit of a problem, that, when you don't. Yeah, the funny thing happened to be on the way to the ballot box, yeah.
Now, we did talk about, outside, we had a little chat about Joe. What a lovely period of time that was for you. Joe for Prime Minister. Joe Bjelke-Petersen.
Well, look, I thought that was a little sort of speed bump on the road of life, to say the least. It was a huge hill, it wasn't a speed bump. Look, I thought, the Joe for PM campaign was always a fantasy. The idea that, and going back essentially 40 years, politics in Australia then was, it's still a bit parochial, but it was more then than it is now. I give credit to the Bjelke-Petersen government. They did some very good things for Queensland. And they believed in investment, they believed in business opportunities, and we all believe in those things. But the idea that you could do that without a long-lasting coalition with the Liberal Party was fantasy. Queensland is different from other parts of Australia in that the bulk of the people do not live in the capital city. You look at the vastness of Western Australia, the majority of the people still live in that area. Now, Queensland's different. And as a result, it's always had a stronger country party or national party flavour, which is understandable. But in the end, of course, the Joe for PM campaign did reduce, I'll put it gently, our chances of winning in 1987, stopped by the refusal of the National Party or country party in other parts of the nation to help it. I remember we kept the joint Senate ticket in New South Wales, even though the federal coalition had been broken. And I remember the night I had a meeting in my home in Sydney with Bob Sparks, who was then the late Bob Sparks, who was then the chairman of the Queensland National Party, and other leading figures. And Joe had come down with them. I think they'd come down on his plane, and which fair enough, his plane. I think in the end, though, he wanted to stay away from the meeting, and they said that they talked about it all, and they reluctantly had to pull out because they felt without the support of the National Party in New South Wales, they couldn't spread the thing around the country. And they were very critical of their National Party colleagues in New South Wales. I thought those National Party colleagues were heroes because they'd said, no, this is madness. But life went on and we reformed the coalition, and the only serious point I'd make to any of my party supporters who might be here today, or any of my colleagues, I know Angie Bell is here, and federal colleagues, state colleagues, is the coalition is crucial. And this idea that you ought to go your separate ways and then come back and it'll all be much better. It's a bit like people saying, I'm having trouble with my marriage, I think I'll try an open marriage for a few years and see how it gets on. I mean, really, it doesn't quite work out that way. I have not observed it working out that way in life, and I'm getting myself into terrible...
Yeah, I think I better rescue you. You made your way through. You were then leader of the opposition. There was a bit of a coup against you at one stage, and then there was the John Hewson birthday cake instance, and before you know it, you're back in power. An election, and you won with a huge majority, 60-something%.
Well, we won with a huge majority in 96 because people wanted a change of government. They thought the Liberal Party and the Country Party had got back together and was stable. I mean, I was very lucky to have in Tim Fisher, the late Tim Fisher, and then John Anderson, who I've said before and I say again, I don't think I've met a more honourable person in public life than John Anderson, somebody that I could trust. And his policy instincts were not old-fashioned interventionism. He believed in having a reformed labour market, he believed in privatisation, he believed in a GST and tax reform. He was a wonderful person to work for. And then Mark Vaile, who was really the architect on Australia's side of the free trade agreement we had with the United States in the later years of my government. But one of the greatest things that those people and what they represented, and Rob Borbidge, the former Premier of this state, also represented, was their willingness to support our response to the Port Arthur tragedy. Now, Port Arthur...
We'll go into that a little bit more in a moment.
Port Arthur...
I was going to say, I'll come to Port Arthur in a minute. So you were elected. Did you see yourself as a reformist?
Well, yes and no. I went to the job with a number of policy priorities, but what you've always got to allow for in politics is the unexpected challenge. And that's where Port Arthur comes in. That happened on the 28th of April, 1996. Only, 6 to 7 weeks after I'd become Prime Minister. 35 people killed with those automatic, semi-automatic weapons. Just think of what the death toll might have been at Bondi just before Christmas if those madmen had had possession of the weapons that we were able to ban in the wake of Port Arthur. And it was 35 people, and I just felt that at the time, and a lot of my advisors said, oh, look, you can't ban them because the federal government doesn't have the constitutional power to do it. And we didn't. We could ban imports, but we couldn't ban the possession and sale. That was just a matter for state governments. And I thought, well, what is the point of being elected Prime Minister with this huge majority? And we had 35 people killed in cold blood, and only a few days ago I caught up in Canberra because of the 30th anniversary and television station doing a program on it with Walter Meacock, who, poor man, whose wife and 2 little girls were murdered. And he wrote to me about it, and it was just, he epitomised me. He wasn't the only person who was aggrieved, but he represented what it was. And I just felt I had to try hard. I had to just if necessary, ride roughshod over those of the states who objected. And I admired Rob Borbidge because he had a lot at stake. He was the only Premier of the whole country who held votes largely from the bush, not totally, and it was tough going for him, but he went along with it, and I admired him for that, and so did Tim Fisher and John Anderson. They were great, and in the end, I went to a meeting I happened to be in Canberra when there was a meeting of the police ministers, chaired by our Federal Attorney General, Darryl Williams, and Darryl came around to me and he said, "Oh, you're in Canberra, what are you doing here?" I said, "Oh, I just had a few letters to sign, I wanted to be there." And I said, "How are you going?" He said, "Oh, they're all on board," but he said, "Western Australia and Queensland are more reluctant," which I understood. But in the end, they all came on board, and of course, what we did was very popular in the cities. I still get women in Sydney, if I go walking around the streets, who come up to me and say, "Thank you for what you did on guns." Now, you wouldn't get that in America. I do remember an incident after I'd been voted out. I went to see George H.W. Bush's library in College Station in Texas. And they put on a wonderful lunch for me. I thought I'd been at a Liberal fundraiser in Kalara or Toorak. And they were very nice, and this wonderful man got up and said, "Prime Minister, what are the things you're most proud of?" And I said, "Oh, we stood side by side with America in the fight against terrorism, big cheer. We balanced the budget, big cheer. We introduced a total prohibition of the ownership and possession of automatic and semi-automatic weapons." And there was a huge intake of breath. And when I resumed my table, that lovely President 41 leant over to me, "John, you pulled the wrong rein on that one." Now, it's just a different country. And long may it remain different unless they change to the way we see things. And
So during that period of time, as Prime Minister, you tackled the massive deficit, you had the waterfront disputes, you had Tampa, border protection. There was a whole range of issues that were compacted into that 12 years. I don't know, I saw a period of time there was so much for a Prime Minister to take on. Was it daunting?
well, I think we achieved a lot. And I talk a bit about guns because I'm very proud of what we did, and it was an example of something that I never dreamt would land on my plate. Waterfront reform is different. I'm very proud of what we did in waterfront reform, and I am eternally grateful to that courageous Australian businessman, Chris Corrigan, Patrick Stevedores. To achieve reform of the waterfront, you needed a businessman who was prepared to put his economic and business future on the line, and Corrigan did that, and I admired him for it. There were plenty of business people around privately saying, I wish we had a government that had the guts to do something about it. Now, we found that with Corrigan, and he was terrific. That was the big thing about that waterfront dispute, bruising though it was, is that we ended up with greater productivity. And you're hearing a lot of that word these days, productivity, because it's very low at the moment. And it was very low on the Australian waterfront in those years. And we were able, because of the reforms we introduced, we were able to lift productivity beyond the average of the Western world, and I'm very grateful for that. I'm very grateful, of course, the help I got from my colleagues. Peter Reith, no longer with us, he did a great job on the waterfront. He even offered at one stage to resign because a couple of the court decisions had gone against it. And I said, "You can't do that. That would be an admission of defeat, and we're not going to be defeated unless we're going to win it." And he was great.
Border security. It's really
Oh, well, border security. Look, I mean, how much time you got to talk about border security? All those European countries, I can tell you when we said we will decide who comes to this country and the circumstances in which they come, there was an enormous amount of tut-tutting out of the Northern Hemisphere. And country, I mean, I remember the exchanges that Alexander Downer had with the Norwegian. You mentioned Tampa. Well, Tampa was a Norwegian flagged vessel. And they thought we were wild colonials. You now have European countries saying Australia was right, because no country can have a completely open immigration system. No country can. If you try that, you're buying yourself trouble. But what you can have is a very generous migration program. And this country has been a massive beneficiary of migration. Huge. Now, I just think of a simple test. The surnames of the premiers of the various states of Australia. Malinauskas, I don't think that's... I mean, I grew up in a suburb, Earlwood, which had lots of Smiths, Kellys and McDonald's. Now, Malinauskas, I think, is a Estonian or Lithuanian name. You have a wonderful lady in the Northern Territory who's got a gloriously ringing Italian name, and of course you have, in this state, you have a Crisafulli. And I wouldn't be the least bit surprised if some of his ancestors knew something about cane in North Queensland. Now, isn't that an example of my point? Now, it's all happened, and it's all happened seamlessly and in a natural path. And that's because we have been welcoming. We've said to people who come to this country, you're very welcome and thank you for choosing us, but we would like you to be integrated or assimilated. I was never a fan of multiculturalism. Multiculturalism means one thing to some people, and maybe what I'm lauding is what to those people multiculturalism means, but I think it means that you have a nation of tribes and that every culture is equal. Well, I don't believe that you can run Australia as a nation of tribes, and I think the Australian culture is different and better than any other culture. And I feel quite strongly because one of the things that I think has distinguished Australia is that we have a great sense of balance. I mean, I think of the inheritance we had from the British. I mean, we owe the Brits a lot. We owe a free press, we owe freedom of speech, constitutional law, trial by jury, all those things that we take for granted. But we chose those, but we didn't choose, and we deliberately rejected any notions of class, snobbery, aristocracy, or difference based on other than somebody's values and somebody's willingness to contribute to the local community. Now that was something, and that sense of balance, we've done very well. I mean, I look at the social welfare systems around at the moment. I think with all the excess, and there's a lot of waste in social security now, but that's another matter, and I won't weary you with it, but for all its flaws, we have a better system than the American. In America, if you're down on your luck, you're not helped a lot. In Europe, you're almost helped too much. And it's very hard if you're running a small business in France to get rid of an employee who's causing a lot of trouble. It's very difficult, and I think we've struck a sense of balance on those things, and that's what helps this country. And people get up and pontificate about Australian values and the Australian way of life. Well, part of it is having a sense of balance.
Now, I was in down the War Memorial a few years ago, and they said that Parliament House was designed that from the Prime Minister's desk, he could see through the doors straight down to the War Memorial. And it was designed so that when he had to make a decision to send troops to war, he'd remember there'll be names on the walls down there. You had to send troops, or you chose to send troops.
Well, I did, and it's the hardest thing you ever do. And in the end, it is the Prime Minister's decision. I mean, I'm happy to say that the decision we made to commit troops to East Timor, to Afghanistan, Iraq, the Solomon Islands, that I had strong support from my National Party colleagues, John Anderson, and I'm very strong support from Peter Costello, who was a magnificent treasurer, and Alexander Downer, really strong support from both of them. And yet, in the end, if I'd said, look, I've changed my mind, and they'd have all gone along with it. So I accepted in the end it was my call. Now, fortunately, they agreed with it. And I can't forget the night that Jeanette and we went to Townsville. Because the troops were disembarking they were going on the mission to Timor the following little while, the following few days. And we had a meal with them in the mess. And then we wandered back to our car and we went past groups of soldiers talking to their NCOs. And Jeanette and I just thought, golly, those poor men, some of them could be dead tomorrow. And you can't not think that now. Thank a good Lord and good leadership that didn't prove to be the case. We had surprisingly few battle casualties in East Timor, and indeed in Iraq we lost 41 men in Afghanistan. And I think a lot of that was due to the tremendous leadership. Peter Cosgrove, who commanded the mission, was an outstanding war leader, and he was an outstanding Governor-General because he's an outstanding Australian. And he just had that right mix of happy-go-lucky larrikinism, but also authority. And you need the combination of the two. Military leadership requires an ability to, I'm no expert on this because I'm never in the military, but what I've observed, you need a capacity to relate as a human being to the men and women you lead, but you also need to command authority, and he did all of that. And the meeting he had with his counterpart in the Indonesian military before the intervention commenced was crucial to keeping the temperature down, and it turned out to be a very successful, but nothing equals that. And I had more sleepless nights over it and over what was happening in Iraq, and particularly on the eve of the military operation in Iraq, because Iraq was very unpopular. And I accept that. It was unpopular, not only in Liberal and Labor, but also a lot of Liberals didn't agree with it. And I understood that. And I think mistakes were made after the intervention. I didn't think Australia made, and to this day I support very much the decision my government took to commit forces to that operation. But it was tough.
I'm aware of our time constraints, so I jumped through to obviously the big issue of the time, which was Peter Costello, leadership. So I understand you two will never agree on exactly that discussion, but at the end of the day, your belief was the party will make the decision. If they want me to go, I'll go. If they don't, I'll stay.
Well, look, in the end, politics is something that is inexorably driven by the laws of arithmetic. And I became ultimately the leader of the Liberal Party prior to being elected Prime Minister because the majority of Liberals then decided that I was the best hope they had. Now, if the majority had decided that somebody else would be the best they had, or more likely than others to hold Mr. Rudd back, then they'd have got rid of me, because they did it before. I became leader in 1985 almost by accident. I was removed by ambush, and I was re-elected by common consent, no opponent. And look, inevitably you have different recollections of discussions, but the leader of a political party owes his or her job to the members of the parliamentary party, full stop. Now, they in turn respond to the views of their members, of their party or the public, and that is governed by a whole lot of things. But can I just say that Peter and I, we will never agree on certain aspects, but gee, I had a lot of enormous respect for the job he did as Treasurer. He was an outstanding colleague, and we had a wonderful partnership. And we would never have got tax reform without Peter's work. We'd have never reduced debt. And he made a comment the other day, which I think has so much relevance and salience, that people are talking about the difficulty of young people buying a house. And he made the point, in a debt-free country, it's easier to afford a house than it is in one that's mired in debt. And that is so true. I mean, what he did by his very prudent management, more than anybody else in the government, was to bring about a elimination of $98 billion of debt. The idea of this country being debt-free is just beyond the reach of anybody's comprehension at the moment, and it should not be so, but that's another matter. And you've been a very tolerant audience for...
So tell me...
Polly, you raised on too much.
On that leadership issue, is this a case that both of you, Peter Costello and yourself, believed that you would be a better Prime Minister, and that he just believed that, or was it the belief, it's just my turn, I want to have a go now?
Well, to be fair, that's a question that should be addressed to him at the same time. Look, in the end, the case was that the majority of my parliamentary colleagues believed they had a better chance of success by sticking with me. Now, whether they were right or wrong is a matter of personal judgment.
Well, I don't want to glue that comment to my next, which was on the 24th of November 2007, member of the Parliament for 33 years and 6 months. You're the 12th longest serving MP in the history of the nation, and the second longest serving Prime Minister, but you lost the election and you lost your seat. Was that a humbling moment?
What, losing the seat? Well, as it turned out, it avoided a minor technical problem. I mean, if I'd have lost the election, obviously I wouldn't have continued as leader. And I don't think the new leader of the party would have, if I had held on to my seat by a few hundred votes, I don't think the then leader would have wanted me to go in a by-election, and I'd have been hanging around like, I think one of my later colleagues in the office called a miserable ghost. I don't think I'd have wanted to have been a miserable ghost, and I don't think any of my colleagues would have been hanging around. So, look, we lost the election because a clear majority of the Australian people felt that they wanted a change. Did they want a change in Prime Minister alone, or did they just want a change in government? I think they wanted a change of government, knowing that that would change the Prime Minister. And they elected Mr. Rudd with a clear majority. I accepted that. I didn't like it. We were talking earlier about what you like and dislike. I mean, I rang Kevin Rudd at night and I congratulated him and said, you know, we'll be out of the lodge in a few days, and gives a couple of weeks to get out of Kirribilli House, and he was feeling generous, as I understood, and he said, oh mate, no problem. Well, I mean, I had the same attitude in 96, and then moved out, and I didn't like, but you have to do that. And I mean, we haven't talked much about Donald Trump. I have mixed feelings about him. I know he's the most powerful man in the world, and he reminds everybody of that.
Daily.
When he leans around that door on his Air Force One. I thought his failure to accept the result of the 2020 election condemned him as a Democrat. I don't mean Democrat Party, I mean as a Democrat small d. In politics, when the umpire's finger goes up, you leave the field. You don't like it. I didn't like ringing Kevin Rudd, and I'm quite sure that Paul Keating did not like losing to me. Although I will say this in his defence, that a few months later when my wife, and thank the good Lord and a wonderful surgeon, she got over it, but my wife was diagnosed with cancer and I was very concerned, understandably. He rang me and he said, "John, I'm very sorry to hear it." And he was genuine because he knew the sacrifices she'd made. And families make an enormous sacrifice in politics, and we've continued on, and I'm very grateful for her and divine providence and good surgeons and all that. But look, in politics you've got to accept the good with the bad. I had mixtures of both. I mean, on credit side I think it's greater, and I've been very fortunate. But when you lose, you've got to accept it. And I just think it's part of it.
So, we know we're getting close to the end of our time. I was going to give you a couple of things, quick comment on them. The Liberal Party, 2026.
Oh, the Liberal Party 26 does not look good, but I believe that the changes that has been made at the top, and this is not meant as a criticism of Susan Ley, I think Angus Taylor will be a much more effective leader than the person he replaced. I think it was an error. If I had been asked, I wasn't. No, I wasn't. I would have said publicly that I thought Taylor would have been better then. Now, I've no criticism of her, but I just didn't think the party was making ground. And I do think that the new deputy from Senate is good. I think the changes made by the National Party are unexpected but good. I like Matt Canavan. He's a Queenslander, and I've nothing but admiration for them. But he also knows how to mount an argument. He can win an argument, and that's very important. So I'm hopeful, but we've got a lot of work to do.
Putin?
Putin? Look, Putin is a Russian nationalist. He's not, he's a Soviet, he's a member of the Communist Party, but you can draw a straight line between the dictatorial czars and Lenin and Stalin and Brezhnev and Putin. And he's pretty, I've met Putin on a lot of occasions. He's the only leader of Russia ever to visit Australia. He did that in September of 2007. Very humorless. I would not have liked to have been the advisor to him on whose face he stared when I mentioned at the luncheon we gave him that Alexander Kerensky, who students of history in the audience will know, was the leader appointed as the Prime Minister of the Provisional Government of Imperial Russia after the abdication of the Tsar. Kerensky's survived his first wife. He met his second wife in California, and she had come from Queensland. And sadly, she was diagnosed with cancer, and not long before she died, she said, "Look, I want to go home to Queensland." And they came and lived in Queensland and died here. And then I'd been provided, I didn't know this, and I'd been provided with this information, which was, and I asked for all the sources I just hadn't heard of it. And I was satisfied, so I used it in my speech. Anyway, Putin looked at this fellow, and what he was really saying is, why didn't you tell me this? I don't like the Prime Minister of Australia knowing this about one of my predecessors. Now, there's a sequel to that story, which has a quaint Queensland twist. Some days later, Peter Beattie, with whom I had a very good relationship, let me say, we were different sides of politics, but I found him a man you could talk to and reach an understanding with. And we were talking about this incident, and it's because when Putin gave his speech, Rudd got up and thanked me for my remarks and said, along with me, that he welcomed Putin to the luncheon and it's good to have him back in Queensland. He was a Queenslander, and he was, I don't think he said then I was here to help, but anyway, he then said, oh, I'm glad the Prime Minister mentioned all of that. I wouldn't want you to think that Queensland's full of Bolsheviks. Now, Peter Beattie pointed out to me how inappropriate that comment had been. He said Kerensky wasn't a Bolshevik, he was a Menshevist. Those students of Russia's history we know was the other faction that overthrew the Tsar. But anyway.
Now, I've got about 35 other topics, but we're clearly not going to get through them all. I was just going to share one little thing with you. You lost the election in November of 2007.
2007.
And I was at the Olympic Games in Beijing in 2008. And we're just about to start the opening ceremony. I thought, I'll duck up and just have a little twinkle before the opening ceremony. I'm up there was nobody else in the men's room. Then I just felt the presence of someone coming in and a couple of urinals past me, and I looked across and, okay, John. G'day, John. How are you? And there you were. Oh, g'day. Hello. How are you? Oh, and we just chatted away, and I went, that's remarkable. A year before, he would have been Prime Minister up in the Royal Box, and he was down here with me in the public. And I thought you were just so humble that you were just a normal person, not sort of taken back by all the frills that go with Prime Ministership. And I've seen you here today. I've seen you with so many people. You're such a down-to-earth, humble man. It's just been a delight to have you here. And I wanted to say, Mr. Howard, you've been described as relentless, reliable, tenacious, gutsy, determined, and with conviction. I just say, in all my years with you being Prime Minister, I just felt safe. I felt safe with you being our Prime Minister. Now, you're the second longest. You're the second longest serving Prime Minister in Australia. And this marks your 30th year from when you were elected Prime Minister. And I want to say thank you for serving our country so well. I'm sure your parents, if they were looking down today, would go, wow, we never thought he had it in him. I mean, nobody knows at that start of their life how life unfolds, but what a remarkable life that you have had. And so, John Winston Howard, it's been an absolute honour spending the last hour and a bit with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.